Breaking analysis. A ceasefire with Iran is quietly reshaping global oil markets, and it could change how the U.S. negotiates with Canada in 2026. On January 20th at Davos, Mark Carney positioned himself as the anti-Trump voice of the Western world, bold, defiant, refusing to bend his core pitch to Canadian voters. Canada holds the cards because America needs Canadian energy, and he won't be bullied in trade negotiations. But here's what most coverage is missing. That entire argument just hit a complication no one saw coming. An Iran ceasefire announced days ago with barely any political fanfare is quietly reshaping global oil markets. And if you understand energy economics, you know what that means. When Middle Eastern supply stabilizes, North American oil leverage shifts. Not dramatically, not overnight in the Hollywood sense, but enough to matter when you're sitting across from Trump's team trying to renegotiate Kuzma with energy as your trump card. If you want coverage that connects these dots instead of treating them as separate headlines, subscribe now because this story is moving faster than most outlets are tracking. Let me walk you through exactly what changed and why it matters more than the Davos speeches suggested. Mark Carney is not a typical politician. He's a former central banker who ran the Bank of Canada during the 2008 financial crisis, then went on to lead the Bank of England through Brexit. He understands markets, leverage, and negotiation at the highest levels of global finance. On January 16, 2025, he officially launched his campaign to become Canada's next Prime Minister, and his message was sharp from the start. Canada will not be pushed around, not by Trump, not by anyone. This wasn't generic political posturing. Carney built his entire opening argument around economic sovereignty, the idea that Canada has structural advantages that make it impossible for the United States to bully it in trade negotiations. And the centerpiece of that argument, energy. Canada supplies the United States with more than 4 million barrels of oil per day. That makes Canada the largest foreign oil supplier to the United States. Not Saudi Arabia, not Venezuela, Canada. And critically, much of the U.S. refining infrastructure along the Gulf Coast and Midwest is specifically designed to process heavy Canadian crude. You can't just swap that out overnight. So Carney's pitch to voters was both economic and strategic. Trump needs us more than we need him, especially on energy. And if Trump tries to rewrite Kuzma, the trade agreement between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, in ways that hurt Canadian workers or Canadian sovereignty, Canada can hold firm because American energy security depends on that cross-border oil flow. It was a confident message. It was a message designed to appeal to Canadians exhausted by years of trade uncertainty and tired of feeling like the junior partner in North American economics. Then came Davos, the World Economic Forum, January 20th, and Carney leaned into the role. While other Western leaders offered what analysts described as degrading supplication to Trump's incoming administration, Carney delivered a provocative speech that positioned him as a defender of multilateralism, climate action, and democratic capitalism against the rising tide of Trumpism. He didn't name Trump directly in every sentence, but the subtext was impossible to miss. The speech was covered as a bold political move, Carney staking out his identity as the anti-Trump candidate, and the Trump administration noticed. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, one of Trump's top economic advisors, fired back almost immediately. Bessent warned Carney not to virtue signal and said bluntly he rose to power on an anti-American, anti-Trump message. And that's not a great place to be when you're negotiating with an economy that is multiples larger than you are. That line matters because it's not just a political jab, it's a negotiating signal. Bessent is telling Carney and telling Canadian voters that the size differential between the U.S. and Canadian economies means Canada cannot win a pure leverage fight. The U.S. economy is roughly 10 times the size of Canada's. In a trade war, Canada suffers more, faster. Bessent's message was clear. Your tough talk is premature, and you're setting yourself up for failure. But here's the thing. Carney wasn't wrong about the energy leverage, at least not entirely. Canada does supply a massive share of U.S. oil imports. The U.S. does depend on that supply for refining stability, and any disruption to that flow would create real problems for American energy markets, especially in the Midwest. So Carney's argument had weight. It wasn't bluffing. It was rooted in actual economic interdependence. Except there's a variable in this equation that almost no one in the political press connected, and it's a variable that just shifted, not because of anything Carney or Trump did, but because of something happening thousands of miles away, in a region most North American political coverage treats as a separate story entirely: Iran. In mid-January, credible reports began surfacing that Syria's ceasefire and diplomatic momentum was building around Iran's nuclear program and its broader relationship with the West. Sanctions relief was suddenly on the table in a way it hasn't been in years. The details are still emerging and nothing is final, but the direction of diplomacy is clear enough that global energy markets are paying attention. And here's why that matters to Mark Carney's campaign strategy. Iran has the capacity to add more than 1 million barrels of oil per day to global markets if sanctions are lifted or reduced. That oil doesn't directly replace Canadian crude in U.S. refineries. The infrastructure and crude quality are different, but it does something more subtle and more important in this context. It increases global supply. It reduces scarcity. It stabilizes crises, and it gives the United States more flexibility in its overall energy sourcing strategy. When oil markets are tight, when supply is constrained and prices are high, the U.S. has a strong incentive to maintain stable, friendly relationships with its most reliable suppliers. That includes Canada. In that environment, Carney's argument holds maximum weight. Trump's team has to think twice before destabilizing the Canadian relationship because energy security is on the line. But when oil markets loosen, when supply expands and prices stabilize or soften, that dynamic shifts. The U.S. still needs Canadian oil, but the urgency decreases, the sense of dependency decreases, and the psychological leverage that Carney was counting on in CUSMA renegotiations, that decreases too. This is not a catastrophic change. Canada is still the largest foreign supplier. The infrastructure is still in place, the oil still flows, but leverage in negotiations is not binary. It's not all or nothing, it's marginal. And when you're building a political campaign around the argument that you can stand firm against the largest economy in the world because you hold a critical resource advantage, even a marginal shift in that advantage is a problem. Let me make that simple. Carney launched his campaign with a clear theory of power. Canada has energy leverage. Therefore, Canada can negotiate from strength. 4 days after his Davos speech, the global oil supply picture started shifting in ways that weaken that leverage. Not destroy it, but weaken it. And the political press covering Carney's campaign launch and his Davos confrontation with Bent has almost entirely missed the connection. CUSMA, the trade agreement between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, is up for review in 2026. That's next year. Trump has already signaled he wants aggressive changes. His team has talked openly about revisiting terms they think favor Canada and Mexico at the expense of American workers. The review is always going to be contentious, but Canada's traditional defense in these negotiations has been, we're your stable, reliable, geographically adjacent energy and resource partner. Don't destabilize that relationship because you need what we supply. If global oil supply is loosening because of Middle Eastern diplomacy, that defense just got harder to sell. Trump's team can now argue, we have options, we're not desperate. You need access to our market more than we need your oil at any price. And psychologically, that shift happens before the formal negotiations even begin. It changes the tone, it changes the confidence level, it changes who feels like they're negotiating from strength. And here's where Carney's political problem starts to come into focus. His entire campaign launch was built on the message that Canada won't be bullied, that Canada has structural leverage. That economic sovereignty is not just a slogan, but a reality backed by hard resources. Energy was supposed to be the proof point, the concrete example that made the tough talk credible. But if that energy leverage is diminishing, not disappearing, but diminishing, then what's the replacement argument? Does Carney double down and hope the Iran diplomacy collapses? Does he pivot to other resources like critical minerals, rare earths, or water access? Does he shift the campaign message away from leverage entirely and towards something else? Domestic manufacturing, climate leadership, social policy. Those are real strategic questions, and they're questions that most voters won't track in real time. But political campaigns are built on narratives, and when the foundational narrative starts to shift under your feet 1 week after launch, that creates risk. Not immediately, not in the polls tomorrow, but over time as the contradictions accumulate and opponents start pointing them out. Scott Bessent already took the first shot. He framed Carney's Davos performance as virtue signaling and warned him about negotiating from weakness. If the oil leverage argument continues to erode, Bessent's framing starts to look more accurate, and Carney starts to look like someone who overplayed his hand before understanding the full board. Now step back and look at the broader geopolitical picture for a moment, because this is not just about one campaign or one trade negotiation. This is about how global energy shifts ripple through regional power dynamics in ways that rarely get covered in real time. Most political journalism treats these as separate stories. Carney's campaign, Trump's trade policy, Iran diplomacy, Middle East energy markets. They get filed under different beats, covered by different reporters, analyzed in different segments. But the actual world doesn't work that way. The actual world is a system where a ceasefire in the Middle East changes the negotiating calculus in North America, where a diplomatic breakthrough in Tehran weakens a political argument in Ottawa, where energy markets and trade agreements and election campaigns are all connected by the same underlying logic. Leverage is never static, and the leaders who understand how it shifts are the ones who survive. Mark Carney understands markets. He spent decades at the center of global finance. He knows how these systems work, but he also just launched a political campaign with a very specific message at a very specific moment. And the moment is already changing in ways that complicate that message. The question now is whether he adapts fast enough or whether his opponents use this shift to undermine his credibility before he even gets to the negotiating table. There's a specific mechanism at work here that's worth understanding because it explains why this matters more than it might seem at first glance. When the United States sits down to renegotiate CUSMA in 2026, the formal agenda will be about tariffs, labor standards, dispute resolution, digital trade, and a dozen other technical provisions. But underneath all of that is a simpler question: who needs this agreement more? Trade negotiations are not purely rational exercises. They're psychological. They're about perceived strength. And one of the most powerful forms of perceived strength is the ability to walk away. If Trump's team believes the U.S. can absorb the disruption of a renegotiated or even suspended CUSMA better than Canada, they push harder. They demand more. They give less, but if they believe that disrupting the agreement creates serious problems for American energy security or American supply chains, they moderate, they compromise, they protect the relationship. Carney's entire bet was that energy dependence would force moderation, that Trump's team would look at those 4 million barrels a day flowing south and decide they couldn't afford to gamble with it. But if Iranian oil is quietly easing global supply pressures, that calculation changes. Not entirely, not even mostly, but enough to matter. Enough that Besant can credibly say, "We have options, and you're the one who needs to be careful here." And this creates a messaging trap for Carney, because if he backs down from the tough talk now, he looks weak. He looks like someone who overestimated his position and got called on it. But if he doubles down on the energy leverage argument, while that leverage is actively eroding, he sets himself up for a very public failure when the actual negotiations begin. Either way, he's in a harder position than he was on January 16th when he launched this campaign. Now, Carney is not without other cards to play. Canada has leverage beyond oil. The U.S. depends on Canada for critical minerals that are essential to advanced manufacturing, defense systems, and the energy transition. Rare earth elements, lithium, cobalt, nickel, these are not commodities you can easily source elsewhere, especially if you're trying to reduce dependence on China. Canada also controls vast freshwater resources that will only become more strategically important as climate pressures increase, and Canadian lumber, despite decades of trade disputes, remains central to American homebuilding. So the question is not whether Canada has leverage. The question is whether Carney can successfully pivot his campaign narrative to emphasize those other leverage points without looking like he's retreating from his opening argument. That's a political problem, not just an economic one. Voters respond to consistency and strength. If your message shifts too quickly or too obviously, it reads as weakness, even if the underlying analysis is correct. There's also the possibility that this entire calculation flips again. Iran diplomacy is fragile, ceasefires collapse, sanctions get reimposed. If the current momentum falls apart, global oil markets tighten again, and Carney's original argument comes roaring back to life. In that scenario, his Davos positioning looks prescient, not premature. He looks like someone who understood the strategic landscape before others did. But that's a gamble. That's betting on external events you don't control to validate your political strategy. And experienced politicians know that's a dangerous game. What makes this moment particularly significant is the timing. Carney is not an incumbent defending a record. He's a challenger trying to build momentum. The first weeks of a campaign set the narrative. They establish who you are and what you stand for. If those early weeks get defined by a contradiction between your message and the underlying reality, that's hard to recover from. Opponents will return to it again and again. They'll use it to argue that you don't understand the world as it actually is, only as you wish it were. And Carney has a specific opponent waiting to make exactly that argument. If Pierre Poilievre or another rival can frame Carney as an out-of-touch elitist who gave a big speech at Davos while missing the real shifts happening in global energy markets, that's a damaging line of attack. It plays into existing skepticism about cosmopolitan technocrats who sound impressive in international forums but lose track of the practical realities that matter to ordinary voters. Here's the other piece of this that almost no one is discussing. The United States benefits from this situation in ways that go beyond oil. If Canada's negotiating position weakens going into COMAS talks, the U.S. has more room to push for favorable terms on issues that have nothing to do with energy. Digital services taxes, dairy market access, pharmaceutical pricing, lumber tariffs, dispute resolution mechanisms. These are all fights the U.S. wants to win, and they're all easier to win if Canada feels like it's negotiating from a weaker position overall. So even if the oil dynamics don't change dramatically, the perception of shifting leverage creates opportunities for the U.S. to extract concessions across the board. That's how trade negotiations actually work. You don't just negotiate one issue at a time in isolation, you negotiate the whole package, and the side that feels stronger on the big structural questions tends to win more of the smaller technical battles as well. This is what Scott Bessent was signaling when he talked about the size differential between the economies. He wasn't just stating a fact, he was setting a psychological frame. He was saying, you can talk tough, but at the end of the day, we're 10 times your size, and you need us more than we need you. And if global energy markets are shifting in ways that reduce your single biggest leverage point, that frame becomes harder for Carney to counter. The risk for Canada is not immediate disaster, it's slow erosion. It's a series of small concessions in 2026 that add up over time. It's accepting terms that previous Canadian governments would have rejected because the leverage to resist them is gone. And it's voters looking back in 2027 or 2028 and asking, what happened to all that tough talk? What happened to the promise that we wouldn't be pushed around? Carney understands this risk. He has to. He spent years negotiating with governments, central banks, and financial institutions at the highest levels. He knows how leverage works and how quickly it can shift. The question is whether he can adapt his campaign message fast enough to account for these shifts without undermining his own credibility in the process. That's the test, and it's a test that's happening right now in real time while most of the political press is still focused on the Davos speeches and the personality clashes. If you're following Canadian politics, if you're tracking CUSMA, if you care about how trade and energy and geopolitics intersect in ways that shape your economic future, this is the story to watch. Not the surface drama, not the quotes and the counterquotes, but the underlying shifts in leverage that will determine who wins and who loses when the actual negotiations begin. Turn on notifications because this will develop in ways the headlines won't capture, and the leaders who see it coming will be the ones who shape what happens next. Mark Carney launched his campaign for Prime Minister with a clear theory of power. Canada has energy leverage, and that leverage creates space to stand firm against American pressure in trade negotiations. 4 days later, an Iran ceasefire changed the global oil equation in ways that weaken that leverage. Not catastrophically, not overnight, but enough to matter, enough to create a political problem that Carney will have to solve if he wants his campaign message to survive contact with reality. The leaders who adapt to these quiet changes, who see the shifts before they become obvious, are the ones who survive the bigger fights. And the leaders who double down on arguments that the world is quietly moving past, they're the ones who get remembered for being confident, articulate, and ultimately wrong about what mattered most. That's the choice Carney faces now. And how he responds in the next few weeks will tell you everything you need to know about whether this campaign is built to last or built to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Geopolitics doesn't pause for your campaign launch. Markets don't wait for your messaging strategy to catch up. And the intersection of those two realities is where the real story lives. This is that story, and almost no one else is telling it to you this way.